Welcome to the IWP podcast, coming to you live from the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C. I'm Jim Robbins, Dean of Academics at IWP, an accredited graduate school of national security, intelligence, and international affairs, offering a variety of certificates, master's degrees, and doctorates, both in person and online. You can check out our programs and our courses at our website, iwp.edu. The White House press corps has become obsessed with the question of President Biden's red lines for Israel and Gaza. Where is the red line? Has Israel crossed it? Will we know if they have? And by what metric? Does the red line even exist? Questions like this have become red meat for reporters. Note that what I'm talking about today isn't the question of White House policy towards Israel and Gaza, just how they're communicating it. The issue is how the White House set itself up for failure. The red line was drawn on March 9th when MSNBC's Jonathan Capehart asked the president, "What is your red line with Prime Minister Netanyahu? For instance, would invasion of Rafah, would you have urged him not to do it? Would that be a red line?" "It is a red line," the president said, "but I'm never going to leave Israel." He stressed that the defense of Israel is still critical, so it did not mean cutting all aid, but he said there's red lines that if he crosses, and then the president's answer became vague. In a later interview, Biden clarified that going into Rafah was what constituted a red line foul. But when Israel, in fact, started going into Rafah on May 6th, the White House was forced to clarify. So, taking the Rafah crossing, moving slowly into Rafah neighborhoods, taking control of the Gaza border with Egypt, even sending tanks into the center of Rafah itself, none of these actions crossed the red line. The matter became acute when an Israeli airstrike on Hamas targets killed scores of Palestinian civilians. Horrific video from the scene showed charred corpses and a decapitated child. Surely this crossed the red line. No, according to NSC spokesman John Kirby, because Israel is, quote, not moving into a major ground operation in population centers in the center of Rafah, unquote. The White House even takes credit for Israel having listened to their concerns and moderating their tactics, something Israel denies. But defining the red line as major ground operations is the kind of subjective definition which will only mean more such questions will be coming no matter what Israel does. This is not the first time a president has been left red-faced over red lines. In August 2012, President Obama said he had been very clear to Syria's leader Bashar Assad that a red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized. He reiterated the point several times. Even then, Vice President Joe Biden said, "We've set a clear red line against the use or the transfer of Syria's chemical weapons." And none of this redlining would have been all that controversial, except that Assad actually did use chemical weapons. Then the White House made the mistake of trying to deny that a red line had ever been set, or that the president didn't really mean it, or that it meant using a lot of chemical weapons instead of just a few, or that Obama didn't set the red line, but as he said, the world did, even though the world didn't. Red lines are dramatic rhetorical gestures, and once they are drawn, they become irresistible storylines for the press. The issue is not whether red lines should exist, because sometimes they should, but rather it becomes a question of credibility when they are not enforced or are explained away after the fact. Another similar example of this Washington parlor game was the reinforcements issue during the Vietnam War. For purely political reasons, President Johnson decided that U.S. force commitments to Southeast Asia had to be limited. In 1965, he publicly authorized a maximum of 125,000 troop deployments to Vietnam. But this number immediately began to creep upward based on military necessity. And every time they had to raise the number, it became another press story. The troop ceiling finally leveled off at 525,000 in the summer of 1967. Again, a completely subjective limit that had been determined politically and not based on military necessity. But the impression was that this was a line Johnson would not cross. And for the rest of that year, U.S. forces in country stayed slightly below this self-imposed limit. But the following spring, after the Tet Offensive devastated North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, military leaders saw an opportunity to escalate the war and finish the job. A heated debate raged between administration factions over whether to hold to the arbitrary troop limit to hold it sacrosanct or not. Then internal Pentagon documents regarding the reinforcement debate were leaked by Daniel Ellsberg and appeared in the New York Times on March 9th, fueling public controversy over White House credibility and whether the U.S. was actually winning the war as the administration claimed. The troop increase request alone was taken as evidence of panic. Had there been no announced troop limit, this story would not have landed as hard as it did, if at all. As it was, the media storm that resulted blunted the move to take more concerted action in Vietnam, and the rest is history. So getting back to Gaza. For the White House, the Red Line dispute is a self-inflicted wound, an artificial, irrelevant issue over something the president never should have said in the first place. It puts the administration in a permanent defensive posture in which every move by Israel will be measured against this hypothetical line, resulting in continued questioning and skepticism. Like the temporary floating pier that broke apart and beached, the Gaza Red Line has become another symbol of weakness for an administration that has lost control of both events and the narrative. Thanks for tuning in. If you like this podcast, please share and subscribe. For IWP, I'm Jim Robbins. Join us next week for another edition of the IWP Podcast.